Tonight on Nation to Nation, a former bureaucrat says the federal government continues to miss the mark when it comes to addressing racial discrimination in its ranks.
They're still continuing to blame the employees for the harms that have been done onto us.
An ex-soldier talks about how the racism and stress he experienced during the Oka Crisis played a deciding role in his decision to leave the military.
And when the government of the day called out the military against its own citizen, that was a pretty horrific time for Indigenous veterans.
And we'll hear from an organization that is trying to find the photos of two Indigenous World War II veterans.
They have to be remembered, and their sacrifice should never ever be forgotten.
Welcome to Nation to Nation. I'm Fraser Needham. In 2021, APTN News brought you the story of Leticia Wells, a federal bureaucrat with Indian Oil and Gas, an agency of Indigenous Services Canada. She told us that she had been discriminated against by co-workers and managers. The federal government promised a full review at the time. So far, the government has failed to produce this full review. And now she's part of a class action suit that alleges racial discrimination, sexual improprieties, and abuses of power at the government agency. She joins us today from Calgary. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
All right, I guess first you worked at Indian Oil and Gas, I think, from about 5 years, from 2015 to 2020. What was your experience there?
I had a fantastic experience with Indian Oil and Gas Canada up until the fall of 2019. That's when everything changed. I believe that I was targeted through systemic discrimination and racism. I believe that I lost my contract as a casual and a term contractor because I spoke up against the discrimination, harassment, bullying that was happening against me. And I believe I was targeted by a non-Native manager in this role.
Now, because of your complaint, Indigenous Services Canada and CIRNAC promised a review of two departments in 2021 to address complaints like yours. Have you seen this review?
No, I have. Well, I've seen the TLS report that the government released in December of 2021 and then redacted it immediately after it was released. This TLS report on IOGC had 78 recommendations that they recommended to improve the toxicness within the company. And unfortunately, the report is sitting on deaf ears. I have to admit, it's not doing anything to help the Indigenous people within Indian Oil and Gas Canada right now.
Right. Yeah, we asked for the same thing. We got sort of the kind of the bullet points that we share with you about kind of what's happened, but of course we didn't get the review either. Seeing that they have not shared this yet, and it has been a while since like 2021, we're going on a few years now. What does that kind of tell you, I guess, in your mind about where the government is at with complaints like yours?
Well, I think the government does not take these complaints seriously at all. I don't know how we're ever supposed to decolonize an institution within the federal government in reconciliation with these systemic investigations that uphold systemic standards. And I think the biggest problem is that they do not understand the recommendations in how to align with operational plans, because the cultural competency within the recommendations is misunderstood. And I think the government has a huge problem of trying to solve Indigenous problems from an approach of top-down theory. And that is the hugest problem stopping the government from decolonizing, because what's happening today is they're still continuing to blame the employees for the harms that have been done onto us. And so all of the solutions that the government has currently provided in the bullet points, they're failing our people still to this day because they're not being interpreted on an Indigenous world view regarding the historical traumas, current traumas, connected with Indigenous people, especially women. And so I think the government is struggling at a hierarchy level, at an exec level, at a manager level, with trying to implement these recommendations in Western colonial framework. And again, they're butting heads. And so rather than trying to find a proper solution for this, they're just going to give us a bullet point form saying, this is what we've done to help Indigenous employees. We're trying. But again, too, it's a systemic approach that is doing nothing to help anybody, and actually things have gotten worse.
Right. Now, the Auditor General, we discussed a little bit previously before doing the interview, released a report last month that saying that several government departments and agencies didn't have mechanisms in place to deal with discrimination complaints like yours. What do you make of that? That that they're not really measuring how their inclusionary policies are working?
Because I don't think they have the tools to measure that. The first and the foremost thing that I see within federal government, as well as private institutions, non-Indigenous or in non-profit Indigenous organizations, there's a common theme, and that's people don't understand the violence that Indigenous women face in society. And therefore, cultural competency regarding us in our treatment is misunderstood. And it's also controlled by colonial framework within federal government. So they provided a process towards Indigenous peoples without having an inclusion of an Indigenous worldview.
Okay, well, we'll have to unfortunately end it there, but thanks very much again for joining us today and talking about an issue that I know must be difficult, and you made a lot of time available to us, and we appreciated it.
Thank you for having me.
Coming up, we'll speak to Timolone, an Indigenous veteran who speaks publicly about his experiences in the Canadian military, including racism, PTSD, and establishing a new career. Welcome back. About 70 people bowed their heads at the Aboriginal War Memorial in Ottawa yesterday to mark Indigenous Veterans Day. The memorial sits a short distance from the National Memorial near Parliament Hill. Thousands of Indigenous people have answered the call and joined Canada's military in times of peace and at times of war. Timolone is one of them. He joined the military when he was 17 and had a 10-year career which took him to many places, including Winnipeg, Petawawa, and Baden, Germany. Since leaving the military, he has worked for the government of the Northwest Territories and served as an advisor to Chair Marie Sinclair on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Today is a high-end demand because he speaks about Indigenous veterans issues, racism in the military, PTSD, and reconciliation. Timolone joins us today in our Ottawa studio. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Fraser. It's a pleasure to be here.
All right, so you were 17 when you joined the military with permission of your parents, of course. Right. And yeah, what made you decide that at that young age that you wanted to get involved?
Well, at that time I was literally out of high school, like I think 3 weeks out of high school. I didn't know that there were options being college or university. I had an older brother that joined, and the lights kind of went on. I needed to not be in the house anymore and start my adult life, and I had only seen the military as my only option, to be honest. I pumped gas at that time, and I knew that wasn't a career. And so when my brother joined, I thought, okay, this is my way out, and I'm going to do the same thing.
Right. Is that when you were in the forces talking to other Indigenous people and things like that, is that the sense you've got even from talking to veterans as they sort of join the military sometimes because they didn't see too many other options?
Well, you know what, that could be the case, and if you look historically, Indigenous peoples, and in particular Treaty Indians, joined because they had numbered treaties. They had treaties with the Crown, so that was the community's way of meeting their obligations via the treaties. A number of individuals, and as you can imagine, with the military, it is a lot of the poorer communities go off, certainly the case with Newfoundland and places like that, to go off and join the military, and certainly that's the case with the Indigenous population. Is a way to kind of get out, I guess, per se, and make a fairly good living.
Right, and then of course your time, those 10 years that you're in the military, put you you were in the military during the Oka Crisis. you know, and you were saying earlier that you might have been sent out there, so you're fully aware of, obviously everyone was aware of what was going on, but you could have been in. And of course there was sort of a backlash against First Nations people and the non-Indigenous population, just the nature of the crisis. And that, what was that like for you to be caught right in the middle of that?
You know what? I was interviewed and asked the question, how do you feel if we get called out? Because we were about to go. And I said to the Sergeant Major, I said, if you don't mind, Sergeant Major, why don't we get called out first before I answer that question? Because there would have been no way. And it was a very stressful time for Indigenous soldiers. Because the reality is, in the Army, you're trained to think about the person at the other end of your rifle is the enemy. And when the government of the day called out the military against its own citizen, that was a pretty horrific time for Indigenous veterans, Indigenous serving members. And I have talked to others, and they were in the same boat. And, you know, some people just got up and left the military because they just simply cannot take up arms against themselves, of course. But that was a dark time. It was a tough time, and it was a tough time for Canada as well. There was constitutional discussions at that time. It was very dynamic. People were asking me questions about, like, what is it that you folks want? And I didn't really have the answer. And the reality was because of the stress and such, it planted the seed for me that maybe this isn't the institution that I no longer wanted to be part of. And it took me a couple of years, but I ended up departing fairly quickly thereafter.
Right, and you kind of mentioned a bit in your bio too, and I'm sure you talk about this, like this sort of group mentality that the military has. Did you feel any possibility that you could say, you know, even though you understand your job, that these are also people that you consider sort of an alliance with, in a way of culture, that, you know, that maybe people should sort of tone down some of the racism, which isn't necessary?
Well, it's at that time racism was very high, right? And so I'm not sure if there's anyone can control to say you need to tone the racism down, because it's prevalent and it was the institution. And like I said, I no longer wanted to support. At that time, though, I really thought, is this the institution that I want to spend my career? I was 27 at this time, and was I going to get a fair shake or not? And I really couldn't, I couldn't answer the question that I was going to get a fair shake, career-wise, promotions and such. So then I realized, you know what, I think it was time for me to depart, and which was a good move for me professionally. That's when I went to university and started my professional career. But, you know, I kind of, as I look back now, I think about, and I want to displace the negativity with some of the friends that I served with. You know, November 11th is a emotional day for me. I've had friends that had passed, and I tend to go down to Beechwood Cemetery and visit them. You know, for my own mental health, I try to displace the negativity and remember the amazing heroes that I had the honor of serving with, and I still keep in touch with some of these heroes.
Right, and I guess just to stick on that point, and then we'll talk a little bit about after service, but you talked about participating in the Invictus Games, and are things slowly changing? Have they gotten better, I guess, in the military in terms of racism? Well,
I'll tell you right now, I left in 1993, and physically and spiritually wounded. I was not going back, and I worked at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I had a mental health decline afterwards, to be honest. And Veterans Affairs was all in, so I was grateful for their supports. And as part of me being in the Valley of Darkness, I had a friend said, hey, you should put your name in for the Invictus Games. I submitted, never thinking, because there were well over 1,000 people submitting their names, and I got selected. And it was an amazing journey. It gave me a mission again. And I went back to, as part of our training camp, I went back to 2 military bases. And I had to kind of humble myself and realize that the military is not the military that I had left. There were some really good people there. And a lot of times people heard about my experience with the racism, and they were visibly upset. And I thought, wow, you know, the people that were on that team, they all had physical and spiritual injuries. But I have to say, they were a really good group. And so I had to, what's that term, eat crow, and realize that, and admit that it wasn't the dark, demonized military that I had left, that it really was more reflective of the population that it serves. And I'm not here to admit that there's no racism, but the racism is, I would argue, much lesser than the one that I left in 1993.
Okay, well, we'll have to end it there, but Timolone, thanks for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks very much. Take care.
After the break, we'll speak to Peter Valkenburg from the Faces to Graves project about this organization's search for the photos of 2 Indigenous World War II veterans in Canada. Welcome back. A program connected to Canadian war cemeteries in the Netherlands is looking for help finding the photos of 2 First Nations soldiers killed during World War II. Faces to Graves is a digital project that puts photos to the names of soldiers killed overseas, and they're looking for information on Benjamin Roy Asque and Charles Thomas Nanus. Peter Valkenburg is one of the program's researchers, and he joins us from North Tryon, Prince Edward Island. Welcome to Nation Nation.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so first off, maybe you can tell our viewers a little bit about the Faces to Graves project.
Yes, quite a few years ago, one of the Canadian war cemeteries in Halton, started a project, and they called it a face to every name. And that's what it was, the initial project. Then it was taken over by the other 2 Canadian war cemeteries, and also the municipal cemeteries in the Netherlands are involved in this project. They are now trying to build a virtual monument. And for that, they need photographs, they need input of families with regards to non-military information, so that they can write a biography of the soldier and put that online. The project has been going on now for about, I would say, 7, 8 years. And they've gathered quite a few names, but on the other hand, there's still a lot of soldiers that don't have photographs. And me being from Dutch origin, I'm now trying, and living in Canada on Prince Edward Island, I'm trying to help them with this.
Okay, and how many soldiers would you say are in your database?
In the total database of ourselves, or in total in the Netherlands?
Oh, I just say in your particular project.
In my particular project, at the moment, we have found over 220 soldiers that are buried in the 3 Canadian war cemeteries, and a total of close to 300 if you include the other cemeteries.
Okay, and now we'll move to talk a little bit about the 2 people that you're looking for. What do we know about Benjamin Asque and Charles Nanus?
Benjamin Asque was born on the 16th of April 1922 in Cape Croker, the Cape Croker Reserve in Ontario. I know from the service file that his parents were Bert and Ida Asque. He had 2 brothers, Nelson and Percy, and Nelson also served in World War II, but Nelson came back. And apart from the 2 brothers, he had 3 sisters, Hilda, Bessie, and Ella. He enlisted in London, Ontario on the 6th of June 1941, and he went overseas the same year in October. In September 1944, he went to France, and he was killed in action on the 29th of November 1944 in the Netherlands. On his gravestone it says, "Dear Benjamin, what it meant to lose you, none will ever know." These are inscriptions. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission invited the parents to put an inscription on the soldier's stone. In this case, I think it was the father who put this inscription on the stone, because the mother had passed away in 1939.
So we just talked about Mr. Asque. Can you tell me a little bit about Charles Nanus and what we know about him?
Yes, of course. Charles Nanus was born in, if I pronounce it right, Shabanaka Reserve, and he was born on the 5th of May 1919. His parents were Charles and Pauline Nanus, and he had 3 brothers, Simon, Michael, and Leonard, and 1 sister, Marie. He signed up in 1941 in Petawawa, and he served first in Newfoundland in 1942, and then he went overseas in 1943. He left the UK in 1944 in July, and he landed in France 2 days later. He lost his life in 1945 on the 8th of March. And he was initially buried in Germany. Later, he was reburied in the Canadian War Cemetery in Groesbeek.
As is Asque.
Yeah, and so it's the same with Mr. Asque. They are both buried in the same Canadian War Cemetery.
Oh, okay.
And yeah, on his stone, I like to read the text of his gravestone. It says, "We think of him, his name we oft recall. Nothing is left to answer. He gave his all." I found that a very nice text, and I was emotional when I read it the first time.
We'll have to end it there, but thanks very much for joining us today, Mr. Valkenburg.
Okay, thank you for having me. And hopefully we will get the 2 photographs of the soldiers that we are looking for, so that we can honor them also they will be honored on the virtual memorial eventually, but it would be nice to put a picture there as well.
If you or anyone you know has information that could help the Faces to Graves project locate photos of Benjamin Roy Asque or Charles Thomas Nanus, you can contact Peter Valkenburg at this email address, memorialtrail@gmail.com. Once again, that's memorialtrail, all one word and in lowercase, @gmail.com. And to end tonight's show, here's some sights and sounds from yesterday's Indigenous Veterans Day ceremony in Ottawa. I'm Fraser Needham. Good night.